Hi, and welcome to the course Launch Your Podcast, a beginner's guide to podcasting. I am Samuel Adiri, the chief troublemaker at Podlub, and your guide for this course. Welcome to lecture 3 of module 3, where we will be talking about the last 3 things you should do before you hit recording. In two previous lectures of this module, we talked about the podcast topic subject matter. We also covered your avatar or ideal listener. We talked about podcast or your show format, and we rounded our last lecture with what we call the podcast title or name. But in this lecture, which is lecture 3 of module 3, we will take a look at what we call the podcast summary or description, your show name, and lastly, your podcast artwork. So we'll delve right straight into the fifth item on our list, which is your podcast summary or description. Now, this is usually a paragraph description of your podcast, and it is useful in any of the following cases. One, when you're trying to pitch your podcast to somebody, or you say, okay, I'm the host of Switch Podcast, and the person's like, okay, what's Switch Podcast? This is where your podcast summary comes into action. Also, when visitors are visiting your website, they want to know what your podcast is all about, especially if they're just hearing about your show for the first time. It's also important in your intro to your podcast. It should be as brief and short as possible for those who are listening by accident. Maybe they collected maybe a listener shared the audio with them and could not explain well what your podcast is all about. That would cover for that. Also in iTunes, people search, like I said in our previous models, iTunes is like a big directory. It's a search engine of its own on the podcast. So when your podcast pops up, it should come up with a short description about what your show is all about. Now you also need to make sure that you use keywords in crafting your podcast summary, especially the written version of it. It makes people who don't have the patience to read the whole summary, your keywords allows them understand straight away what your podcast is all about. Just as with your podcast title, don't be too crazy about your podcast keywords. Just make it flow naturally. Now, iTunes allows up to 4,000 characters. That does not mean you should make it to 4,000 characters. If you can explain what your podcast is all, in fact, more is less. If you can explain what your podcast is all about in 2,000 characters, fine. I mean, let's take a look at what a podcast summary looks like, especially for Switch Podcast. If you notice in the top left corner, you see Switch Podcast, Entrepreneurship Brief, Business Interview, Startup Guide, Word Game, without having to read the whole paragraph. A visitor already knows what Switch Podcast is all about with those keywords. Now, if he wants to read more, he can go on to read Switch Podcast is Paul Loeb's interview-based channel hosted by Samuel Adiri. And then you have my podcast title, 7, my nickname, startup entrepreneur, civil engineer, business consultant. Gives them an idea of who I am. Focused on bringing you entrepreneurs, business owners, teachers or educators, startup founders, the words highlighted, researchers and enthusiasts whose experience, stories, discussions, and online resources you can learn from. It is it is all encompassing, and those words highlighted are keywords that I want it to rank for on iTunes. Now, because I could go further to talk about the structure, the format. You have this on Switch, not Switch podcast. Word game and entrepreneurship or business flow together. If you're an aspiring entrepreneur wishing to make entrepreneurship as a career, this is much more than a training guide. It's a catalog of information, a brief of knowledge and innovation, and a documentation of strategies you will need on your entrepreneurial journey. Words highlighted are words I want the podcast to rank for. So that's an idea. Don't be crazy about 2 paragraphs. One is enough to start with. And as time goes on, when you fully understand what you want to talk about, you can have a second paragraph. Now to your host name. No, basically, as the name implies, like someone was asking for a definition of something. There's all this two word thing, and host name, and you say, what is host name? And you say it's the name of a host. It's as simple as that. It's just your name and a short title of yourself. If we go back to my podcast summary, you will notice I said Samuel Adiri, 7, startup entrepreneur, that's my show name. Or it could be your nickname, or your host name could be totally different from your own real name. If you're a hobby podcaster, this works fine for you. I mean, this is great. It should also be short and catchy. Let it be very short and catchy. And you know what? It's not that deep. It could just be your name and some title that describes who you are. If you're crazy enough, you could go with a short show name, some nicknames, some coded names, some CIA ish, you get some, SSS ish, you grab. But otherwise, just keep it simple. Now, let's talk about the last thing on the list, which is your podcast artwork. This is very important. This is very, in fact, sometimes this is the first thing a visitor or a stranger comes in contact with your podcast. And if he doesn't like your show, your artwork, that's like the end of of your attempt to get him to listen to your podcast. Even though podcasting is an auditory medium, it has an element of graphics to it. It has, and it should have some sort of visual impression it should make on your listeners, because they're looking at the websites with their eyes first before they use their ears. So you want to make an impression that draws them in to click on that play button before they can make a final decision as to whether they want to stick with your show or not. It needs to be beautiful. It's as simple as that. Every human being loves beautiful things. I mean, yes, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. I'm not arguing about that. But we are naturally drawn to beautiful things. So your podcast should be beautiful. The maximum size should be 3,000 times 3,000. It shouldn't be less than that, because people are listening to your show on various devices, and a podcast artwork should display well on a very, very, on an high end smartphone, iPhone 7, whatever, on whatever advanced or new model smartphone your listeners are using. It should be able to display very well on it. It should be in JPEG or PNG file format. Shouldn't be outside those two, and it should be in the RGB color space. You want to also optimize your test for a very small resolution, especially when your podcast is shown on iTunes. I think it's usually 150 by 150. A text that is basically small on a 3000 by 3000 artwork, pixel artwork, would be difficult to read on a 150 by 150. Now, take a look at Switch Podcast, the artwork with Switch Podcast. You see the mistake we made. Whereas for the keywords, you can barely see it. You can barely see what it looks like on a 3000 by 3000 pixels. So I thought it was great. But when it shrinks down, you can barely see that. But thank God you can still see Switch. You get. So that's one mistake you don't want to make. Now I want you to take a good look at all the artworks here. Take some time out to select the 3 most striking artwork for yourself. Take a mental note of this artwork. And now select 3 other artworks that you think was just totally not it for you. I'm doing mine. I'm selecting mine. Okay, yeah, let's move on. Now, there are don'ts of podcast artwork. Trust me, if you abide by this rule, you end up creating a very, very effective artwork. Don't use too many words. It's not a blog. It's not an infograph. Even infographics don't use too much words. Just your title and your show name is sufficient enough. Don't use more than two fonts. Too many fonts can be distracting. So if you're using, I don't know, whatever font you like, don't use more than two. Don't use microphones, headset, or other overused images. I mean, because it's a podcast does not mean it's all about podcasting. So you put a mic, you put an headphones on, and then you strike a pose. Oh no, it's except if your podcast is about podcasting, so you can have all of that. But if it is not, let your podcast at work tell the story of your podcast. Don't use gimmick fonts. You know all those handwriting fonts? They're distracting. And when you shrink those images down, people barely see it. Just use straight bold text. Make it big. Now let's back to our image. Now with the don'ts, you can see a couple of images that you can barely even read the text beneath it. The podcast artwork that stands out for you, that catches your attention, say something like Science Friday. Just the words bold enough, cereal, on the left hand side, towards the right hand side, is bold enough. I can see selected shots, although I can't see what that small text is all about. All songs considered is also coming out. The Tim Ferriss show is also popping out in my face. HI. If you look at it's popping out. You see minimal text, bold, big enough. There's a podcast using gimmick text. Risk. Maybe I would end up seeing it, but it's not going to catch my attention in the first place. So these are things you want to look out for. Then don't use too much colors. That's something I forgot to say. Limit the number of colors you use to 2, 3. When the colors are too much, it becomes a rainbow, and something else that catch the attention of your listener before the rainbow at work. So what if I'm an hobby-oriented podcast? Your podcast still needs to stand out. It still needs to stand out. If your podcast is about your hobby, make sure it carries an element of your hobby. If you are podcasting about EPL, podcasting about the Premier League, let it carry an element of the Premier League. That's something you should look into. What if your podcast is about you? Use a professional looking image of yourself and with a minimal but large text. A professional looking image of yourself. Maybe there's some free space somewhere where you can insert the name of your podcast and say hosted by so and so. It's as simple as that. If you're a startup oriented podcaster, be creative and just be creative and simple. If you're a business oriented podcaster, it should carry your business logo with some image customers can identify with. So if you're a long-standing business and your customers can identify with certain pictures or logo, let your artwork, but make sure you do it in a way that it blends with your, not that it's just standing out on its own and competing for attention with other elements of your designs. Always remember that simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication. The more simple it looks, the better it is for you. There's so much competition out there on iTunes and any other directory that you want your podcast artwork to stand out. So don't forget the words of Leonardo da Vinci. For your podcast artwork, simplicity again is the ultimate form of sophistication. Congratulations, and this brings us to the end of Module 3. I mean, well done for coming this far. This is what I want you to do. Write down a paragraph description of your podcast. Decide on what show name to go with, if you want to go with anyone at all, or just want to stick with your name. And the last thing I need you to do is to design an artwork for your podcast. If you're done, you could send me an email if you like. I'd like to know what you have on that paper, or would like to see your designs and, just take it in and congratulate you on doing a great job. In our next module, Module 4, we will be taking a look at how you can select a recording gear and take you through all the softwares you need in recording and editing your podcast. I remain Samuel Adiri, the chief troublemaker at Podlove, and your guide for this course. Bye for now. I'll see you in Model 4.